Excited to be here and to have all of you here with us. This is a special event for the Jackson School. Every fall, I welcome our incoming students, and when I do so, I kind of try to lay out my vision for what the school is trying to do. Since we launched the Jackson Institute back in 2010 and transformed into a standalone school in 2022, we have focused on building a small, highly integrated cohort of future global policy leaders. I lay out this idea that in 5, 10, 15 years from now, when our students graduate, they're going to be in positions where they're making important policy decisions, and that they might not always be on the same side of the table when they're in the room where those decisions are being made. And I explained that I sort of hope that the experience of having been together here in New Haven, of having gotten to know one another, of having babysat each other's kids, helped each other through problem sets, that sort of thing is going to help them to work productively and cooperatively in the years to come on matters of international public policy importance. And I'll be honest, when I lay out a vision like that, I don't really know how to measure whether or not we're going to succeed. I know it's what we want to do, but how do you measure success? And it's my great honor today to welcome back to the Jackson School a woman who represents not only the early success of that vision, but was truly one of the most remarkable leaders on the world stage today. The Prime Minister of Iceland, Kristrún Frostadóttir. The Prime Minister graduated from Yale Jackson in 2016. So those of you who are in the audience and are about to graduate, you've got about 9 years, okay? After graduation, she served as chief economist for the Icelandic Chamber of Commerce and at an Icelandic bank. Then in 2021, she ran for the Icelandic parliament and was elected to represent the Reykjavik South constituency. In the 2024 snap election, she led her party to form a governing coalition and was appointed Prime Minister of Iceland. In the short time since her graduation, less than a decade, the Prime Minister has shown herself to be a remarkably effective economist, politician, and leader. I'm honored to call her an alumnus of Yale Jackson, and I'm honored to consider her a friend. I'm so excited that she has returned to New Haven for a conversation with Phil Kaplan, the director of the Blue Center for Global Strategic Assessment. So without further ado, I want to turn the stage over to them. Please join me in welcoming back to Yale the Prime Minister of Iceland.
All right, can everybody hear me all right?
Mic's on.
Mic's on. All right. Prime Minister Frostadóttir, thank you so much for coming back to New Haven and joining us for this. It's great to have you. Iceland is a small nation by geography and population. It's a place that I suspect a lot of American students would know of, but maybe don't know a ton about. And so just to kick off the session, I wondered whether you might give us a general view of the country. Tell us how you think about Iceland and its most important strengths, its greatest challenges, and if there are any aspects of the Icelandic national character that you would want to highlight.
Okay. I'm going to try to make a short answer out of this very reflective question. There's a lot of strengths to Iceland. I mean, Iceland at core has a lot of sort of natural strengths to it. It's a resource-rich country, but there's a lot of countries that have a lot of resources and haven't managed them poorly, and have managed them poorly. So I think we are definitely living in a very fertile area when it comes to that, even though we're in the North Atlantic, because we have fisheries, we have geothermal, we have a lot of power in the region in that regard. Oh, it's off. Sorry, I talk so loudly, people hear me. Is it on?
Yeah.
So sorry, Zoom, if the link didn't carry through. So I would say we have a lot of sort of geological strengths. There are elements also to being in a small country like this, which are, I would say, our strengths. Tight-knit community. People tend to know each other, are very proud, especially after I came into this position, I've never been so proud of my country, not because I'm running it, but because you realize when you go to the international stage how far we've come and how it's not a given that a small population like this can have a democracy, can run its own country and do all these things that larger countries have to do because you require so much capacity. And there was a lot of courageous people that were able to fend and fight for democracy at the time. I mean, the challenges are running a small country. That's the challenges. And also in a vast area. Iceland itself, the island, it's a big island. And so there's a lot of practicalities around that. Just like road system, infrastructure, getting to people, weather. And it's the same thing. What is our strength geologically, for example, in terms of power is also something that can lead to a natural disaster. And so it makes you vulnerable as well. So I think we've done pretty well for ourselves. But I would say, what I'm proud of as Icelanders is, what you need to know about us. And there's a couple of people in the room, and I hope I'm doing this justice. But people care about Iceland a lot. They might be critical about their country, but they're always proud to go abroad and say that they come from Iceland. They care about their culture. They care about their language, which very few people speak, but we've able to keep on to that. And so it's a good community.
That's great. You mentioned coming onto the world stage and representing that community. You're coming straight from UN High Level Week.
Yeah.
Just now.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what your main priorities were and your main messages were for Iceland at the UN this week.
So it's 30 years since the Beijing conference was, where gender equality was a big focus. And Iceland has always, on the big stage, been a firm promoter of gender equality. There's a lot of things that you can do as a small nation to be a beacon of hope, I feel, in certain environments. And we might not have a lot of people or military strength or hard power, but we can have soft power. And Iceland has always had good role models. I mean, one of the reasons I'm here today is because I grew up with a female president. And I talked about this at the UN yesterday. I just thought presidents were female. You know how kids are. They see someone and they just assume, okay, so I can be that. So that's always a message that we carry when we go to these events. But then there's a lot going on in the world today. I don't have to tell this group that. There's a lot of discussions about security, about situation in the Middle East, Ukraine. There's so much to talk about. We need to be on the right side of history, and Iceland is very much aware of that. I spoke at an event for the lost children that have been kidnapped by Russia and Ukraine. So we have been supporting those types of initiatives. So we keep our voice up in any way, shape, and form that we can. But then at the end of the day, you're also there for your country, and you just want to make sure that you can have all the connections that you need to make to serve and keep the interests of Iceland in a good place.
Great. You campaigned on a pro-EU platform, and the country is considering resuming a referendum process for EU accession. And I wonder if you might say a word about how you think about EU accession and how you think about running that referendum process in your country.
Yeah, so I would say the election wasn't very focused on EU. I mean, I am part of the Social Democratic Alliance is pro-EU, but we have people that vote for the Social Democrats that don't think much about the EU. There are some that might have a negative opinion on it, but as a whole, it's EU positive. But there is a part of the coalition agreement where we said that we wanted to have a vote, a referendum on reopening negotiation or accession talks. And I think it's important that there is a double referendum, if you call it that, because in 2009, after the financial crisis, there was a sense that things might be fixed if we just join the EU, which I don't necessarily, I'm not saying that's how everyone who was pro-EU was framing it, but that sort of became the narrative that if we would just join the EU, our financial crisis issues would disappear. And I've always been positive towards the EU, but I've always said it's not a quick fix solution. You're not joining something that's going to fix your currency tomorrow, that's going to fix your job market tomorrow. It's part of a process, it's part of a culture, it's a political project. It's not something you join out of fear, but because you want to be a part of something. And so I think it's important now that, after this time has passed, it's been about 12 years since we opened accession talks and they sort of were put on hold, that we need to put this to bed. We need to decide, okay, do people want to continue, go down this route? And we use our resources to have talks with the EU? Or do we want to just say no for a while? Because you're not going to have a referendum like this every 2 years, right? So my hope is that people will see this as a vote, the first vote on keeping this option, seeing what our options are, because at this point, we don't know what an agreement or negotiation talks would look like.
Staying on your domestic politics, a big priority for you has been the Icelandic economy.
Yeah.
In particular, managing inflation. You have training as an economist, that's your background. Mm-hmm. And you're almost a year into your premiership. So I'm curious how the economic indicators look to you and what you think about in terms of maintaining Icelandic economic stability.
So interest rates are still too high in Iceland. Everyone in Iceland is I don't know how it is in the US, but everyone knows what the inflation rate is and everybody knows what the policy rate is. Like, people are very fixated on the policy rate because it's always been very high. We have our own currency. We have lots of exports, imports, which means that there's been, at times fluctuations in the currency. So I still think we need to get interest rates down, and everything the government is doing that the government can do is in that way. We, at the beginning of the year, we put out sort of a request of savings ideas from the public. It may sound like a naive thing to do, but if you hear the same thing 200 times, there might be some truth to it. And I think it was just very important when this new coalition came about, because it was a clean shift in Icelandic politics, that people felt that we weren't coming in and just running the show as it used to be. And I say this as a center-left politician, which, I firmly believe in the welfare state. I want the government to function, but that's what it has to do. It has to function. That doesn't mean you have to defend everything the government has ever done. Because I think if you don't do that, then someone else will come in and rip it apart, right? So I think that's the biggest challenge when you're in this position, how you can get the systems to work properly. So that means spending the money more wisely. But it also means having an opinion on how the economy in general is run. And so that's why we're launching a new industrial policy. Because a big thing of what drives, for example, inflation, housing market shortages, infrastructure debt, is what types of jobs are created in the country. Are they labor intensive or are they capital intensive? Do they rely heavily on hotels or Airbnbs, or do they rely on data centers or, more capital intensive jobs. And so that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to not just do the little savings, but have an opinion on how the economy works. And it's been a long time since the government has wanted to do that. There's been sort of a fear of having an opinion of what the job market looks like. But at the end of the day, even though we don't run the private economy, whatever happens in the private economy affects the government. It affects healthcare services, the roads, the housing market. And so it's a big project, but it starts off well. We'll see.
Let's shift to foreign policy. So Iceland has no armed forces, but you just received sort of a consultative report from a number of your parliamentary ministers to your foreign ministry.
Yeah.
Basically highlighting that Iceland is nonetheless subject to all sorts of developing and increasing external threats. Mm-hmm. And so I'm curious how you think about designing a defense policy for a country that has no military. What does that look like, and how do you think about it?
So, Iceland has never had a military, and I don't think I will live to see the day when Iceland will have a military. And to be honest, I don't think it would be the best way to use our strengths, so to say. We're a small nation. There's 400,000 people that live there, and our strengths rely on, having facilities for NATO members and others that come and support us. Our defense has always been rooted in a really strong relationship with the United States. Shortly after independence, we signed a bilateral defense agreement with the U.S., and that was sort of also the route to us being a founding member of NATO. And so our relationship with the U.S. has always been very strong. We had the U.S. military based in Iceland for a long time. And even though it doesn't have sort of a fixed position in Iceland anymore, we have still an ongoing relationship with the military. So we have to play to our strengths. That's what I mean. And what our strengths are is strategic positioning. We're in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. We're sort of an unsinkable aircraft carrier, somebody might say, in the North Atlantic. That's not going to change anytime soon. I hope not. And we have done, I think, very well in being good hosts. So our strengths are always going to rely on, infrastructure, airports, ports, any type of technology, research and development, energy providers. And that's something that's also, I think, personally, the smart thing to do when you're a country of 400,000 people is you don't play into having the boots, but you play into having the resources for the boots that come there. And I think that's also, it's both an important message for our allies to hear, for the US to hear, but also for Icelanders, that even if we're in a different security environment, the nature of our defense capacity is not going to change. But we might have more responsibilities, and we are open to that. And we committed to, the 5% targets that were in NATO, we committed to a part of that, which is the 1.5%, because the 3.5% is, I'm speaking with you like you all know what this is. I assume you know what this is. It doesn't make sense if you don't have a standing military, because most of these countries, there's a whole economy around this. But we need to think wisely and with our allies how we spend this money. And there you can also talk about dual use, and we need that in a big geography like Iceland. We need to think about how we can have dual use infrastructure.
Yeah. I saw you speak on the main stage at Munich last year, and you really emphasized the importance of that Arctic geography as pertained to security issues. And so I'm curious if you could just say a little bit more about how you view the Arctic in security terms, and what you think the role of Iceland is in bringing security to that region, providing stability to Europe and the rest of the Arctic, and what you see as the major Arctic security issues.
So for a long time, those of us who lived in the Arctic wanted to keep the Arctic sort of a low tension zone. And obviously we all want to keep it a low tension zone, but I think we can't be naive about it. And I think it's important for us that live in that area to be able to have a voice on what Arctic policy looks like, not have someone who lives outside of the Arctic decide what happens in that area. Because what happens is, as you might know who have been studying international relations, things tend to become concepts. So the Arctic is a concept, but it tends to be forgotten that it's also the home of people. And so how you talk about it matters, that it's done with respect towards those that actually live there and that they have a stake in the game. And I think everyone who lives in that area now is aware that we need to sort of change the way we've looked at the Arctic. There are opportunities that can arise with that as well. There are trade and infrastructure and opportunities that can arise with that if you have, whether it's opening shipping routes or just doing more joint trade in that area. But we have focused in all of our meetings on getting NATO to focus even more on the Arctic. We are part of the Joint Expeditionary Forces called JEF, which has a lot of the Nordics, and the UK is part of that. And so I think these smaller sort of tangents or areas of cooperation are important. So ideas about the Arctic or security policy are not just taken by, sort of the larger entities that might not have a direct stake in it. But at the end of the day, I think nobody is naive about it. We need to have our own policies when it comes to the Arctic, and we are looking directly towards that when we are looking at the infrastructure, dual use, the 1.5%. It's strengthening Arctic policy, and we are open to that conversation.
Great. Speaking of Munich last year, I think it's fair to say that was a real pivot point for the whole transatlantic relationship. The Vice President's speech, I mean, it was palpable in the room that something important was happening and something was changing. Yeah. And I think we've also seen a pretty clear preference on the part of the Trump administration to work bilaterally with countries, right? To not address blocs, be they European or other. And so I'm curious what your administration has done to manage its bilateral relationship with the United States and the Trump administration. How do you think about that specific bilateral relationship?
So, I mean, Iceland has always had a very direct bilateral relationship with the US, I want to say. I mean, obviously, we have a lot of European engagements. We're part of the EEA, which is the economic area of the EU, and so we have that as a big trading partner. I mean, Nordics are obviously close to us when it comes to economy, cultural, and a big part of them are in the EU. But we've still sort of always been a bit separate from mainland Europe in that regards, because we're just not there, right? We're just there. We're in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And we've always had those direct ties because we have had American forces in Iceland for a long time, because we joined NATO with the US. So I don't think it necessarily changes our relationship with the US. We've always had a direct bilateral relationship with them. And I think, what I was talking about earlier with how we look at the Arctic and opportunities, I mean, I think there are even more opportunities to look at that now, how you would bring the US and even Canada. I mean, there's been a lot of talks, which I won't say a lot about, but about, our northerly neighbor. These are very good friends of ours. We have very good ties in that region. And so I do think that there are opportunities that come with this as well. We have tended to maybe historically be at the center of sort of Europe and the US, and now there's the reason for looking up more north in that region as a whole. But we are still part of that area of the US that is so important for them. So yes, there are changes, but Iceland, even though culturally and trade, we've been focused on the EU. We've always been sort of a bit on the outskirts when it comes to that.
Okay. Let's shift gears one more time and pivot to some more personal questions. It was not too long ago that you were a student.
Yeah.
Here in New Haven.
It's so strange. And now you're all looking at me. Yeah, I used to be in this hall. Yeah.
Right. And so, given that we've got a lot of students here looking at you, I'm curious if there's anything in particular that stands out to you about your time as a student at Yale and in New Haven, and if there's anything that's had a particularly significant impact on your career since you've graduated.
Yeah, there's so many things I could say. I don't know, I hope this is how you feel about your time here. These were like my best years. I loved being here. There was so much freedom associated by being here at Jackson, but it was also just a very small and tight-knit community. I heard Jim is still doing potlucks at his house. Is that true?
Yep.
So this was just a very safe space to meet a lot of people, but it was very eye-opening for me as well. I mean, I lived abroad as a child, and I had spent some time abroad, so it's not like I'd never left the country or anything, but there was such a broad group of people who were in my cohort, in my class, both like lots of countries, but also very different backgrounds. And I came here with a background in economics, and I sort of had my eyes set on that profession, and I met people who had done so many interesting things, and it was just a very humbling experience. And I think that's probably the biggest thing I took out of it is, yes, it's good to be a specialist and know your game, and you can't just have small knowledge about everything, but it's still like, it's very humbling to meet people that teach you new ways of life. I met people who were doing humanitarian work. I met people who had been in politics, but also people who had been, working with children or been working in underdeveloped countries. And it just makes you think, having conversations with people from a lot of places. And I do think it's helped me in my job, because I think the best thing you can do if you are, in general, a person, but also a politician, is just being able to put yourself in other people's shoes, having a sense of empathy, humility. And there's not a lot of places where you get such a diverse group of people to be with. And I'm very happy to hear that, even though I know Jackson has been going through changes as a now school, that you've kept this sort of culture because it's good for you. And I would say, like, the best thing you can do is just not keep the shutters on, like talk to more than one group of people and try to understand where people are coming from, because I think that's what we need in today's world. You need to just be able to understand where people are coming from. So that has taught me a lot. And there's also really good pizza in New Haven.
Sally's or Pepe's?
No, I go to Modern.
See?
We are going to Modern later. That's what we're doing.
That's how you know it's real.
If I had to choose, I'd say Pepe's, but I'm not sponsoring anyone.
A lot of our students come from backgrounds where they're in government or are planning to go maybe back into civil service or politics in their home countries. We have, I think, 30 countries represented at Jackson in the matriculating class. And I think it would be interesting for some of those students to hear you talk about the decision to throw your hat in the ring, to go out for elected office. What was that decision like?
It was very random. And I think it's good for you to hear this, because I remember when I was young, it was like 9 years ago. It's not a long time ago. But it shows you how quickly life can change. And it's good to have plans and have goals, but sometimes you just have to go with it. It was random. It wasn't. I just had this conversation with JT earlier. I don't know if you guys know JT. I used to TA for this guy.
And I have people that say, oh, I knew this would happen to you. I didn't know this would happen to me. But, I mean, I had somebody just called me up and asked me to run. It was a group of the youth wing of the Social Democrats that had seen me like do interviews, and they wanted to get new people coming in. And I was kind of at a crossroads, not knowing it in my life, where, you know, I felt like my heart wasn't really in what I was doing at the time, and maybe was pushing me in another direction than I wanted to go. And then someone came in and said, we want you to take this and run with it. And I had actually someone just like show up at my house that had tried to call me, and they came in and convinced me. And I ended up just saying yes. I did not know it would lead to this, but I have this motto of like, if you do things, just do them well. And if you don't feel like you can do them well, you shouldn't do them anymore, because then you probably won't be able to do, you know what I mean? So it's good to have plans. It's good to have a good record of doing what you do well, because then people can trust you. And it's not good to get into the habit of doing things poorly. That's how I feel about it. I've been in those jobs because I wasn't interested enough in them. And it's very easy to say when you come from a privileged position of like all of us, even though we may have come from different areas. But you are privileged of being able to be here. So you should use that as a drive. Do what you do well. Don't overthink things. And then things just kind of happen. I don't know. Another thing I was thinking when I was talking to Jim earlier that reminds me of Jackson is just public service. I ended up doing this job because I think it's a public service, especially for a small country. I just want to serve my country and do things well. If people see something in you and they think you have something to give, it's a good thing to do for a while. And then if people don't want you around anymore, maybe you should just go do something else. So we'll see how long I'll do this.
That's good. Can I pull out something in your last answer, which is you said that part of your recruitment was from a youth wing of your party.
Yeah.
And you are one of the youngest leaders on the world stage right now. You're certainly the youngest prime minister in the history of Iceland. And I wonder if you have any reflections on what young people can and should be doing in politics and how they can make an impact on the world stage.
Oh. I get that question a lot about my age, and I've never really thought that, I never know exactly how to answer it. Age is kind of a number. You have people at very different parts and points in their life make good and bad decisions. I think you just have to know your limits. You have to know what you're good at, especially if you're talking about youth and being young and not knowing. There's definitely things that people who've had this job or been in politics for a longer time would know better about, but that might not have the maturity to make good decisions. But I mean, I think you have to play into your strengths, and you have to be willing to ask questions and not know everything. Because people are more likely to trust you, because people don't expect you to know everything. And so it's good when you're at a certain age. I do think you may have sometimes maybe more room to be a little bit more courageous, because you've just more room to do other things. I think it's also, I've often thought about this because I have two young kids. I have a 2-year-old and a 6-year-old. And a lot of women especially have asked me how you do this? And I've always said it's such a waste that women, and obviously parents as a whole, because you guys should take also family leave if you have kids, that they would drop out of the job market, because this is usually a time where you have a lot of ideas, there's a lot of stuff going on. So you just have to find an equilibrium. I don't think there's one age where you're good at everything. It depends on the person, but just have some humility. Ask for help if you need it. Know where you're at. It's not a great answer, but I don't think that much about it, honestly.
Yeah.
It just is what it is.
Great. I want to make sure that we preserve some time for members of the audience to ask you a few questions. So I think Larissa has a microphone. And if you have a question, as does Vestal, I see a hand from President Ernesto Zedillo. So maybe that's a good place to start with another world leader.
Madam Prime Minister, we are very happy to have you here. I hear your point about your special bilateral relationship with the United States. However, and this I remember from an old Mexican diplomat telling me when I came to office, remember one thing, that the less powerful a country is, the more interested it should be about international law,
Yeah.
international agreements,
Yeah.
and multilateral institutions. Aren't you concerned about the lack of respect to international law, to international agreements, and to international institutions that we are going through? Is that a risk for your country, despite your nice bilateral relationship
Yeah.
with the US?
That's a great question. And don't get me wrong, we can have a good relationship with a country but still be critical of it. I do think there is cause for concern for a lot of reasons when it comes to international law. Iceland is exactly the type of country that has everything to lose if might is what makes right. And so that's exactly why, the question earlier when it comes to what do you say at the UN, you talk about protecting institutions like the UN. You talk about protecting international law. That's why we show up at events associated with Ukraine. That's why we talk about Gaza, So I am obviously concerned about how people talk about multilateral institutions. I do, however, think that we should listen to voices out there that are critical of how they operate, in the sense that I think anything that's been running for decades always needs a chance at restructuring. How you do that matters, though. So, I feel like that is what the UN, for example, is doing now. Guterres is focusing on restructuring the UN because there is pressure coming on it to do these things. And I hope they use the opportunity to do it in a good way. But obviously, we're concerned. And I think that's why a country like Iceland needs to show up at these events and talk about protecting international law.
Question right over here.
I just have a quick question. What is Iceland's position if the Northern Sea opens?
Oil?
Trade.
Trade. You're talking about
I'm talking about specifically for it to be easier for Russia to come through with vessels and such and open up the Asian market a little bit more.
Yeah, it's a very big question. I think discussions on, for example, shipping routes and trade in that area are still, they haven't gotten far, to be honest. They're still very conceptual at this point. But I think this is exactly why we need to have a policy on how we might bring, or be either us bringing those countries together or we bringing countries in that area that are like-minded. That's why, countries like Iceland, Norway, Canada, US, bring in countries that are, close to us from the Nordics, Greenland, Faroe Islands. We need to be leaders in that area because there are changes coming up. But a lot of the stuff that's being talked about is still at a very, very conceptual level, I will say. There's not hard-hitting policy plans going on, but it's still taking place, and we need to be a part of that conversation.
Can we go right here in the front?
Thank you so much, Prime Minister, for your insights and inspiring words. I had a question about the way that politics is run in Iceland and the ways that perhaps this is rooted in the culture. Do you believe that, I know that Iceland has a rich history, culture, do you believe that there are certain aspects of that still permeate and impact the way that politics is run, perhaps even on the more mundane level, voter behavior, political structures that differ markedly from other places in Europe and the US? And then I suppose conversely, do you feel that studying here at the Jackson School and bringing back some insights from the US, if you did bring any back, were these well received and did they incorporate well into the Icelandic political system?
Oh, wow. I think every country has its own specifics, but we're all just people, and things that happen in the world happen in Iceland as well. So even though it's always a bit dangerous to import ideas from other countries directly into your own house, we can't be naive that the same things that are happening in other countries around us, they happen in Iceland as well. I mean, we have people online, and they see everything that's going on in every other place. We have been, I think, lucky in Iceland that politics has been in a rather sort of small space when it comes to the political sphere. People might not feel that way on an everyday basis, but then at the end of the day, they agree on a lot of things. And I think we should be thankful for that. For example, I mean, when in the last elections, there was like a historic shift, there was a big shift in government, but that's not to say that everything that the conservatives did for 60 years was a bad thing in Iceland. It wasn't like they built, some of the things they did were great, right? But I am concerned, I think like a lot of people, that we have, whether it's directly in politics or sort of in grassroots, there's a more push for getting sort of the fringes or the outer skirts of the political spectrum to fight each other. It's one of the reasons why I took it sort of personally when I took over the party, that we would make it what the Social Democrats were supposed to be, which was not like a small sliver of the country or nation, or try to find a different group for every single individual, which tends to be the easiest thing to do. But try to campaign on what makes us, sort of come together. You can have a very political debate about that. You can still be hard on welfare policies. You can have a strong opinion on economic policy, but not be dividing the country into small slivers. So I do think that if we don't, and I'll sort of trace back to what I said before about, delivering on changes. I do think if this government doesn't do well, there will be room for others to come in that might be willing to break things up more drastically. So I think there's a big responsibility of running a coalition that's somewhat center-based, I would say, because I'm center-left, there's a center-right party, but still being able to deliver structural change and being able to be brave, do things that people haven't had the guts to do. When it came to coming back home with ideas from Jackson, I think in Iceland, I think the Icelanders here in the front row will agree with me. I mean, it tends to just be exciting when someone comes home from abroad, right? It's been the same group of people that have been on the news for a long time. And then someone comes and says something new and exciting, and people are generally open to new ideas. I think you just have to be aware, even if I said you can't assume that we're very special and things don't happen in Iceland that happen in other countries, you have to make sure you're not importing things that don't fit, right? We have structurally other issues than in other countries, and it's very easy to just take a concept from a big country like the US and try to squeeze it into Iceland. But I think it's more of a mindset. I think I probably brought just a mindset, just a good Jackson mindset.
Prime Minister, could I pull on one aspect of that answer that you just gave, just because I think it may be something that's on the mind of American students. You talk about sort of managing a politics that moves towards the center, a coalition built around the center, and feeling the pressures of the fringes, feeling people trying to pull fringes off.
Yeah.
In the United States right now, political polarization is the headline topic. And it's a politics that feels increasingly divisive, increasingly pulled towards the fringe in both directions. And so I'm curious if you could just say a little bit more, and maybe even tactically, as a politician, what it's like to run a politics that runs towards the center.
So, I mean, I am center left. I'm a social democrat. I am, I'm not afraid to say, like, I have a politics in me, but I think there's something to be said of, yes, not running too divisive of a politics. And we keep using the same words, but a mindset matters. I mean, a word that I try to push both like with my staff, but also with people in the party is just respect. It gets you a really long way. And not assuming that somebody that disagrees with you or even might be drawn into an easy concept isn't smart enough, just doesn't understand, needs to be told a couple more times, might not have the same morals as you do. A lot of the times, these powers are picking on something where there's a grain of truth to it. Somebody left a space in there for them to run into. And a lot of people that get caught up into easy sort of break up the system ideas just feel like politics hasn't been working for them. And so I think it's really important when you're in this position that you are able to have direct conversations with people and show them that you're actually trying to understand where they're coming from. When I started Parliament in 2021, the first thing I did was I did a trip, and it's easier to do this in a small country, but you can still do this in your own constituency. I did a trip of 50 meetings around the country in like 2 weeks, where we would just host these meetings in like bakeries and small corner shops. And people could just come and have a talk with me about what their issues were. And people were so surprised that someone would just show up and talk to them even after elections because they weren't fishing for votes. And this became like my brand, what I did. People weren't doing this anymore. They would just do this just ahead of elections. And I know like in some countries and some constituencies, people do this all the time. But it really stuck with me because I entered politics very quickly, how much distrust there was towards politicians. People just didn't feel like you were telling the truth. And I took it really personally because I thought, listen, like somebody just needs to change this idea, because most of the people I know in politics are just very honest and good people. You know what I mean? It was just this sense that you weren't delivering. And we had people coming, whether they voted for me or not, and they would sometimes tell me off. And I would even have people like looking at comments, finding that person, calling them up and be like, hey, mister, you want to come to this meeting and just have a conversation about this? So I think there's a lot to be said in today's world of going back to basics when it comes to communication. And I think those that want to fight polarization need to just try to understand where people are coming from. I don't want this to sound naive. There are lines in the sand. I will always stand up for equality, for rights, for human rights. You can't just say anything. It's not the same thing. There's a difference between just assuming people are coming from a bad place and trying to understand why it happens. And that's a big part of the project. I say this to myself every day, just respect. You have to respect where people are coming from. So I hope, we get more respect into politics.
All right, on the far side over here. And I did a bad job the first time. Just say a quick word about your Yale affiliation and your name, so that we know.
My name is Raphael. I'm a professor at the School of Management over here. So I have a question about economics. So you mentioned high inflation in Iceland. Why do you think inflation is high in Iceland? And do you plan on balancing the budget?
plan on balancing the budget?
I hope someone in Iceland is listening to that, because I'm fully committed. We don't have a long ways to go to balance the budget. As an economist, I know that's not the only thing that matters, and I'm not dogmatic about it. But I do think it's important that we can show that we have the discipline to close it. Iceland is high, inflation is high in Iceland for a lot of reasons. We have huge issues with inflation expectations in Iceland because historically inflation has been high, because we've had a small open economy, our own currency. We also have structural, I mean, this is going to take me forever to explain, but we have a lot of structural things. We have like a high percentage of inflation indexed everything. So we're kind of stuck when it comes to inflation for some reason. But I will say there's a good reason to be positive towards them coming down, which is that the government has said and stated, and like I'm stating here, that we will do what we can, that is in our view and fiscally responsibility to do to get down the budget, and I think, or the deficit. And I do think if they see politicians talking sensibly about economics, saying sometimes difficult things, like you can't have everything and it won't cost zero. It can get you a long way when it comes to inflation expectations. But we need to fix the housing market as well. It's a big part of inflation in Iceland. Housing has become somewhat of a financial asset, like in a lot of places. So there's structural reasons, like our own currency, a lot of export imports, fluctuations in currency sometimes, housing market as well, but expectations. And hopefully now there's a prime minister and the finance minister are both economists. So hopefully there's believers in this government. Yeah.
All right, let's go for two more. Another one from this side right here.
Hi, my name is Fan Mei. I'm a PhD student in sociology department. I wanted to ask about climate change since it's impacting Iceland in significant ways. Sorry, were you able to hear me?
Much better.
Okay. My name is Fan Mei, PhD student in sociology. I wanted to ask about climate change and how it's affecting Iceland's ecosystem in significant ways. Yeah. How is the government responding to such rapid change? And what are the challenges that you have faced, if any? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, we see this very visibly in Iceland. I mean, we have a number of glaciers in Iceland. We have a glacier that stopped being a glacier as a result of global warming. We are also a country that is very reliant on the ocean for economic and food security. And people are worried about changing dynamics and how they might affect the fisheries. So it's a very existential thing for Iceland. Icelanders, I think, have a strange sort of relationship to the climate because we've always felt we are very green because we have geothermal and we don't use oil for heating, but we use it for our cars, we use it for our vessels, we use it for flying all the airplanes that come into Iceland. And I think there's a lot to be said of how you decide what constitutes a check in the box in climate goals when it comes to transport, for example. Aviation is one of those things where even though it's crucial for an island to sort of get some leeway in, I will say that because there's just no other way around it, we still have to be critical about those types of industries. When it comes to our climate goals, I mean, we just recently, I want to say, did a bit of tidying up when it came to our plans in that. I think there has tended to be a bit of an inflation. I mean, yes, I took a boat to the Faroe Islands once from Denmark or something. So you have to find ways to make it work. I do think people are getting more aware of it in Iceland. So I hope we'll be able to invest in the necessary infrastructure. We can do that.
All right. And we have time for one last question. And it's going to come from right up here in the front because that's the first hand I saw.
Hi, thank you so much for spending your time with us today. As you mentioned, Iceland is a very small country, about 400,000 people. And especially, I think yesterday, Trump mentioned how the biggest crisis that has been manufactured is the migration crisis. So I would love to hear your perspective, especially as you mentioned how not just capital driven, but also human capital driven industries that you have within Iceland, and how you are managing with maybe demographic changes, but also changes around the world that might situate Iceland in a position to maybe take advantage of some of these things.
Yeah. So Iceland has had a big change to its demographics in a very short period of time. Over the course of 10 years, we went from having migration of maybe 8% of the country was foreign nationals to, I don't know what the recent numbers are, 16, 17, 18% I've heard. Here's the thing about Iceland. I should have said this in the beginning, Phil, when you asked me what's special about Iceland. When we do things, we tend to do them big style, and then they go down again. It's a very sort of like hot and then the balloon pops type of thing. So if you would see a trend in the world, it's like a mega trend in Iceland when it happens. And we did see that with migration. A big part of that was economic migration. Yes, we had asylum seekers. Yes, we had people coming because, for a lot of the same reasons that you saw migration in Europe, but it's just a further ways to go. We obviously had Ukrainians come, but we had a lot of economic migration, which is just through the EEA. And so what happens is somebody posts a job, an Icelander doesn't want to work on it, or has specialization in something else, and somebody comes from Europe. And there's nothing conceptually wrong with it, but I'll say this both as Prime Minister, but also as a social democrat. These are people. They're not just widgets or working hands. And even though you want to have a dynamic economy, you have to also understand that a small country with its own language, where the schools are in Icelandic, the healthcare system is in Icelandic, there are limits to how fast things can change. And it's not just a matter of putting more money into it, it's just you may not have the teachers, you may not have the nurses, you may not have the interpreters. So I think there's a lot to be said about migration. There's a lot to be said about how people talk about migration, and that people need to talking about respectfully about migration and immigration. But I think there also has to be a realistic view that this system needs to be able to internalize that migration. Because one of the biggest worries that I have in Iceland is we have been talking about a tight-knit community. Maybe it's made it simple for us in some ways that it's been a very homogenous society, but it's helped us run a country where people want to pay their taxes, they want to pay for welfare, they see themselves in the person next to them, they care if somebody doesn't get the help that they get. And my worry is that we are importing class stratification in Iceland, that we are importing people who are working jobs that we're not willing to do, those that serve us and us that use the services. And when I talk about, for example, gender equality and all these great things about me being this position and all these other women, I also look at the foreign women that do the cleaning in the houses, that do the cleaning in the corporations, that don't speak the language, people don't know their name, their kids might not do sports, And so do we not care about that? I care about that. We need to just change the discussion of immigration about too much or too little or no one and everyone to how you can run a good community with it. And we need to just be responsible about that, because we also don't want to go down the route of just having a double society. And like I said, Iceland tends to be sort of a megatrend place. And this is one of my big worries. And that's why we're doing an industrial policy. We're not just talking about there's too much immigration. Because so how do we make sure that those that come are not just low-skilled workers? Can we have a wide variety of immigrants come at every class structure, so it becomes more of a normal thing in society, not just the lowest class and then the rest of us.
All right. That brings us to time. We've covered a tremendous amount of ground. Prime Minister, thank you so much for doing this. We have a small token of appreciation for you.
Thank you.
I'll cut the applause only briefly, because just to keep us on time, I think we're going to walk you out.
Yes.
So as we do that, please join me in a final thank you for Prime Minister Frostadóttir.
Thank you. Thanks for having Oh, thanks, the Ukrainian. Yeah, okay. I'm good you read that. Yeah, I'll see you in a bit. Oh. I don't even know. All right, let me
I don't know. You know who might call Nancy? I did bring Nancy up to see.
Oh, good.
But I kept it short.
Anyway,
you know.
and if not, just one for one for her.
If not, we'll mail it to her. You know. I don't know.
Hey.